Hi. So we're going to continue today with our discussion of Memoirs of the Blind. And I want to begin just by, going back a little bit over the point I was making last time about what Derrida calls the three aspects of the powerlessness of the I. That was the a perspective of the graphic act, the eclipse or differential in appearance of the trait, and the rhetoric of the trait. And so to do that, I want to just go back and look at a couple of images, right? Here you have a drawn line, right? So what I want you to be thinking about is what's involved in that, or what's inherent to that. And we could do this as a sort of phenomenological point. What is it to see that as a drawn line? What is it to see a drawing as a drawing? Right? Well, so where to see it as a drawn line is to see it as something that came about through this what he called the path breaking moment of putting the trait down, putting the trace down, putting the line on paper. Right? And let's go back to the very beginning, right? When you first put your hand to the paper. Right? So, let's think first about that moment of when your hand is at the paper. Right? What you have there, when you're in that position, is you have a power, a drawing power, but it hasn't done anything yet. Right? And you have lots of powers. I just want you to think about the kind of reality it is to have a power. You have the power to be a friend, the capacity to be a friend. You have the power to draw. You have the power to use language. Right? You have all kinds of powers. But when you start drawing, you put that power to work. You put it to work, and you make it work. Right? And so that work then, in addition to being the actual thing that it is there, is also the portrayal of the power, right? The actual thing puts on display the potential of which it is the realization. So I want you to think for a minute just about that relationship between actual and potential before we talk more about the line in particular. Right? If you think about that power that you have, right? The power to draw is something real. If you say, "Oh yeah, I know how to draw," if you say like, "Yeah, I know how to play the piano," or "I know how to speak Italian," whatever it is, that power is real. You're not actually doing it at the moment, but it is a reality about you. At the same time, if you don't put it to work, it doesn't amount to anything, right? So like if you think about then what happens when you realize that power, when you actually become a friend or become a mom, right? In a pretty important sense, the actuality of putting that power to work produces a reality that exceeds the power, right? So when you actually are a friend, there's a pretty significant sense in which that's more than just having the capacity to be a friend, right? Just having the power to be a friend, right? So partially what that means is that power, points to actualization as its fulfillment or as its realization, right? And the actual, in an important way, exceeds the potential. It exceeds it, but it also doesn't exhaust it, right? If I talk about having the capacity to play music, right? Once again, it's the actual playing of music that sort of realizes that and so on. But having that power means however much I've actually played, I still could play more things or other things or different things, right? The power isn't in that sense spent in the realization. It's realized, but it's not lost. And indeed, in some ways, it's actually enhanced, right? It's by actually playing music that you enhance and develop your power to play music. It's how you get better, right? So there, again, it remains true that in a significant way, the actualization is more than the potential or the power. But then there's another sense in which the power is more than the actualization. The actualization of your power to play music produces a nice piece of music that people can listen to. but it also puts on display your power as a musician and can make you say about, if you listen to it, you might say, oh, I want to hear what else that person could play or something like that, right? The power is in a way realized in that, but it's also it's never sufficiently realized. It's never fully realized, right? And so it's not exhausted, right? And so in that sense, the potential exceeds the actual. So I just want you to think about those two relationships. So now let's go back to the line, right? So in the line drawn, you have the present line and the whole present scene that it puts forward, right? Now that it's drawn, there is that whole visual field oriented and articulated, right? So in the having been drawn of the line, there came to presence a whole system, a whole finite system, a whole scene, right? And that was the work of that drawing power, right? So the drawn line is both the presence of, right, the present scene, but it's also the presentation of something that can't actually be present as such, namely your drawing power. Right? Another way of saying that is the only way you can see the drawing power is through drawn lines. Just like the only way you can see someone's musical power or musical capacity is through actual musical performances. But you recognize the reality of a drawing power, you recognize the reality of a musical capacity that is not reducible to those musical performances or drawn works, drawings. You don't recognize them any other way than through what is actually present. But they, as such, by definition, are not reducible to those things and therefore aren't ever, strictly speaking, present as those things. They're presented through them. Those powers are present through them, but the very nature of a power is that as a power, it can never actually be present. Right? So the drawn line both makes present the scene, and it presents this unpresentable power. And I was saying, let's think of this as a phenomenological point, right? To see it as a drawn power, to see it as a drawn line, to see it as a drawing, is to see it as the presentation of that capacity. That's what it means to see it as drawn, right? And so that means the drawing both lets you see the visible scene, and it lets you see something that is inherently invisible, something that can't be seen, right? It lets you see the power, right? In a different context later in the book, Derrida refers to what is given to be seen only through the blindness that it produces as its truth. And I just wanted to get you to notice that phenomenologically speaking, you can see this as the presentation of drawing power, or you can, in the musical performance, you can have the experience of their witnessing to someone's musical power, and you might really say, oh, that woman was an amazing saxophone player or something like that, by which you mean something about a power that's being shown to you through that, right? But it's something that you actually recognize in the experience, even though it's the kind of thing that cannot itself be present. In the drawing, you actually, in seeing the drawing as a drawing, you are seeing the presentation of a power, but that's in fact something that can't actually be made visible as such. So there I'm just trying to bring out then the three dimensions in the line, right? There is, first of all, the drawing act, and that drawing act is the one that the path breaking act. That itself doesn't have a line to follow, right? So it's the activity that's in a way blindly venturing forth, right? Then you have the finite, actual, determinate, drawn line, right? That is itself the trace of that path-breaking activity, right? The drawing is the remains of the drawing, right? And in coming to presence, that line which puts the drawing power to work can't fail to be also the a kind of mirroring of the drawing act itself, right? A presenting of its own origin, right? Or what Derrida. So in that sense, the drawing is always the drawing power presenting a kind of image of itself, presenting a kind of portrait of itself, right? So back at page 2 at the beginning, first of all, he's talking about what's going to happen when you draw, and he says, whenever you draw, the draftsman begins to represent a drawing potency at work, the very act of drawing, right? You draw a scene, but you can't fail also to be drawing the act of drawing, right? And again, on page 3, he says, to describe it, he says, we're going to use the Italian name for this hypothesis of the withdrawal in memory of itself as far as the eye can see. We're going to call it the autoritratto of drawing, which is just Italian for the self-portrait of drawing. But he wants to use that word autoritratto because it has all the pieces of word he wants. Auto for self, the re that he's going to use with respect to withdrawal and so on, and then the trait. So that's all I wanted to get out of this, right? That you have the path-breaking moment, you have the finite actual drawn line with its relationship of producing a determinate set of limited realities in systematic order. And then you have you have that as the self-portrait of the act of drawing, but it's a self-portrait that is bizarre because it lets you see something that is, it makes visible that which is invisible. And that relationship I want to underline, right? It's the drawing in a way portraying itself and letting it in a way be seen, letting itself in a way be seen, but the terms in which it is seen are actually contradict its very nature. It's something actual showing something potential. It's something finite and closed showing something non-finite and open. It's something done showing a doing, right? In all of these ways, the very form of the presentation actually is sort of at odds or contradicts the thing being presented. So the self-portrait that drawing is, in a way, has always failed necessarily to portray what it was portraying, right? It is in a way the portrayal of the loss of that which it is portraying. So with that analysis of the three aspects of the powerlessness of the eye, we can now turn to the central theme of the book, which is blindness. Right? So Derrida said, title is Memoirs of the Blind, right? And he says on page 2, he's going to have two hypotheses. The first hypothesis, that drawing is blind. The second hypothesis, a drawing of the blind is a drawing of the blind. Well, I just want to start with talking about that first hypothesis, the drawing is blind. Well, that's in a way what those three aspects of the powerlessness of the eye was showing, right? The path-breaking moment is blind in the sense that you don't already have a vision in front of you of what you're doing, right? It's venturing out into the unknown, right? The actual drawn line is blind because even though it gives you to see the oriented articulated space, it precisely conceals its own origination, right? It's almost like it stands in the way of you seeing the act of drawing. We could say more generally then that the actualization conceals the potential, to stick with those terms we were using a little bit earlier. And then finally, it's in its very character as a kind of self-portrait, there's a certain kind of blindness in that you have to not see what you're seeing in order to see the thing you're supposed to see, right? You have to, and that's what that sort of seeing through is, right? And so in other words, if you start with a kind of paradigm of seeing, if you imagine seeing is how you get stuff. Imagine seeing is what knowledge is like. Imagine seeing is what truth is like. Well, what this analysis is showing you is that in a way at every level, the opposite is the case, right? The the coming into being of the work, the great origination, is pointedly not seeing. That which you're seeing is actually, in seeing it, you're failing to see what's really there. And so to see what's really there, you actually have to not see. You have to, in a way, close your eyes. In a way, you have to blind yourself in order to see what you need to see, right? So, this whole thing, in that sense, you can think of as kind of, let's just treat it at the level of metaphor. It's a little more sophisticated than that word suggests, but that's a good enough way to think about it. Blindness is in many ways a better image for what apprehending the truth is or is like than seeing is. Yes, and so Derrida is actually going to look at things that manifestly present themselves as drawings of the blind, to see what they then are able to, in a way, put on display. And he basically gives three sort of versions of the significance of blindness. So, first of all, this is he looks at these images of the blind from Coypel. And this one first, this is a study for a blind person, right? In other words, it's the artist working at drawing an image that he intends to incorporate into a larger work. So here, what he has drawn is just this sort of uncontextualized image of the blind person doing something, right? So you might think it's just an incomplete work, right? You might think, oh, it's just a study, like you don't really see what the picture is until you see the rest of that. But it's quite interesting for that reason, because here you have the blind person reaching out and touching, and there is no articulation to the whole rest of that scene. So you might compare this image of the blind person to that, the moment when you're going to put the pen to paper, the path breaking moment, but the moment when you haven't yet broken the path, I guess, the place when you're at kind of the fresh canvas, right? This in a way can help to put on display, let you see that moment. In any case, this aspect of blindness that he's looking at here is essentially natural blindness, right? What it would mean to actually, in a sort of physiological sense, not have the capacity to register visual information, right? And he explores the aspects of that, and the main points that he brings out are this need to find your way through things with your hands. One of the points he wants to make there is that you pointedly can't see what you're feeling, and so your hands have to be the leading point for taking you into an unknown that might be dangerous. You don't know what's there, right? So he talks about that in terms of anticipation. If you go back and remember the talk about the now and the relationship between the novelty of the now versus the reiteration of past forms of experience and so on, you could think about that idea that we kind of rely on established familiarities to not let us see and feel the weight of novelty and strangeness. But in a way, the very nature of our experience is that we are always confronting something new, something with respect to which we're blind. And so this image, in a way, draws attention to a kind of path-breaking character that has to be there all the time, a kind of engagement with the unknown that's always there. But that's a kind of blindness we can actually kind of conceal from ourselves, right? And that actually brings us to the next image. This one is again the Coypel sketch study, but it's for error. And so here it's someone who's blind, but it's blind because this person is blind because he's got a blindfold on, right? So this is not natural blindness. This is not a physiological condition of the insensitivity to the visual domain, but is rather the blindness of someone who, by his own choice, is choosing not to see. And of course, that then is an image of something like a kind of moral failure or something like that, right? That we can live in a kind of blindness to the truth by our own choice. We choose not to know. We choose not to recognize what's really there. And there's just a difference between the kind of blindness that inherently characterizes a situation, which on the one case, in the case of these image, would be kind of natural physiological condition of blindness, or in the example I was giving, the necessary blindness of encountering the new moment now or something like that. Right? There's a difference between that kind of constitutive blindness and keeping yourself from seeing, in a way, what's there to be seen. And then there's the third example he gives is the discussion of the cave in Book 7 of Plato's Republic. And I want you to just think about the issues that are raised there. Like here's an image of Socrates before his trial. If you think about the people who were at the trial, Socrates was trying to tell them about their blindness. They're blind to their own blindness, and they end up putting him to death. Not unlike the situation with Muhammad in Mecca, where the people in Mecca can't hear the force of his telling them, about the problems of their ways of living, and they want to kill him, and he has to flee. If you think of both Socrates and Muhammad, right, these are both people trying to get you to see your own blindness, and in both cases, the people are sort of blind to them. But it's also interesting then that the thing that Socrates and Muhammad are also encouraging you to do in seeing, though, is to see something that is in a way not visible. So I'll just leave it with that. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But let's just think back over these things, right? Socrates, at Socrates' trial, these people imagine they're seeing and they're actually blind. And what he wants them to do is put themselves in a situation, basically blind themselves to this seeing, so that they can see something else that can't exactly be seen. Right? Let's just change the words around a little bit. Like what we're seeing in each of these cases, in the blindness that apprehends in the dark, or in this turning away from the everyday seeing, of Socrates in the Agora to apprehend something invisible. In those cases, we're seeing that blindness is a kind of seeing, while seeing, in the case of the people in the law court, or when you look at the image of the oriented, articulated space that the drawn line brings into being, it's seeing as a kind of blindness, right? So in these examples, we're also seeing that very opposition of seeing and blindness has a kind of a problem to it. Like, remember that the drawn line gives you these two articulated spaces, these two clearly differentiated spaces. And the point of the second aspect of the powerlessness of the eye, the eclipse or differential in appearance of the trait, right? This is a kind of blindness, right? There's something occluded in this apparent clarity. Well, you then might think of the very opposition of seeing and blindness in that same way. There you have what appears to be, what you see as a clear-cut opposition. But you might think, what are you blind to in accepting that opposition of sight and blindness? Right? So I'll leave that there, just as a thought to propel you a little bit further. And then before returning now to that issue I raised with Socrates and Muhammad, I want to go through one further topic. Remember, this book is really about the self-portrait and blindness, self-portrait as blindness, blindness as self-portrait. So we've been looking at the phenomenon of blindness. Now I want to look quickly at the phenomenon of the self-portrait. So here, this is a Fantin Latour This is the image on the cover, and he uses this and a variety of other images in the in this part of the book, starting around page 65. So let's just think about this drawing that is putatively Fantin Latour's self-portrait, and I want to make basically 3 points about it. The first is that, straightforwardly, it's just a picture of somebody drawing. I mean, even that's an overstatement. It's a picture of somebody holding something in front of them. But let's allow it to be a picture of someone drawing. What makes it a self-portrait, right? There's nothing in the present image of a man drawing that makes it the self-portrait of that man drawing, right? To know it as a self-portrait, you have to rely on the title. You have to be told it's a self-portrait, right? So that's the first point. The self-portrait, for it to be a self-portrait, there has to be something more to it than just what is presently drawn, right? And that's the titling. That's the title that says to you, this is a self-portrait, right? But so the second thing then is, for it to be seen as a self-portrait, you have to do something, right? It can't show you. You have to adopt a certain attitude towards it to see that. And in fact, well, and so the painting in that way is pointing to something you have to do in order to notice it in a certain way. And in that way, it's very much like this image that Derrida brings out. Lucas van Leyden, a drawing after Lucas van Leyden of Jesus healing the blind man. And he says here, if you look at the blind man, you look at him pointing to his eyes with his fingers, right? The blind man's gesture operates in a space of meaning, a space of experience that he can't actually inhabit. Right? So he is blindly making the gesture of saying, look, I'm pointing to my eyes. Right? The very meaning of that gesture is in a sense meaningless to him. It's a meaning he can't inhabit. So it speaks into this perspective to which he is blind, this perspective of Jesus in this case, or anybody else who can follow that gesture and look at his eyes, right? And so Derrida is saying, in a way, that's what something like the Fantin Latour portrait does too, and it gives itself this title, Self-Portrait, which is kind of like that, right? And indeed, there he says, you basically have had to portray, you've had the image of someone looked at, where precisely what it was to be that self, who was looking in the mirror at himself drawing or whatever it was to be a seeing subject, right? So it's the portrait of an object of a gaze, but it's supposed to be a portrait of seeing. And so that would be the third point, right? The portrait, like the blind man's finger pointing, can't actually inhabit the perspective from which, or by which, or in terms of which it's defined, or in terms of which it is what it is, right? So, and that's something then that you have to do. It announces a perspective that it can't actually present, for which it would be a self-portrait. Oh wait, but that's funny. It's a perspective that it can't actually have on itself. Suddenly, you then have to ask, well, then how can this be a self-portrait? And so for that reason, he says, the self-portrait is always already the ruins of that of which it was supposed to portray, right? It's the thing already having failed. And so what's required, is that kind of what you might think of as the resuscitation, right? And that as it gestures to you to look at it and see it in the right way. Oh, but it can't quite be a resuscitation because it was never anything other than this. There was no point at which it wasn't just the drawing that had already failed to portray what it was portraying, right? And so that's why it's ruins at the origin. It's not like it used to work and then it fell apart. it began as the failure to portray what it had to portray. So I want you then to think about that, because you might think, okay, that's a nice story about pictures. You know, well, it's a little bit of trouble with picture, but remember, a self-portrait is in a way the very meaning of the word I. Right, your sense of yourself is always a matter of getting yourself in view, coming to have a relationship to yourself such that you know yourself or apprehend yourself. Right. So the story of the self-portrait on the one hand is, you know, a reflection on some nice little drawings in the Louvre, which you might or might not be interested in. But in doing that, Derrida is using these works to put on display a certain set of relationships, and those relationships are at the heart of your self-experience. You know, and so, you know, we talked before about the now, you know, where you think, oh, I'm present to this moment now, but we started looking at the ways in which you're not present to it, right? And well, similarly here, we commonly take ourselves to know who we are. We imagine ourselves to be present to ourselves, right? And the self-portrait is in a way showing how we present ourselves to ourselves, and showing that we can never quite meet up with ourselves, right? And so you might then take these reflections on the self-portrait as kind of reflections on self-consciousness, and see sort of analogous problems or analogous issues there. I'm going to leave it with that. I want just to quickly to go through that to kind of bring out these core relationships, because I now want to get back to the thing that from all of this is my main focus, and that is his discussion of the book of Tobit. And the basic story is that Tobit goes blind, and his son goes away, gets married and stuff, and his son comes back. And when his son comes back, he's able to cure his father's blindness. And so his father, who's been blind for some years, now sees his son. But that experience of seeing his son is at the same time the experience of the return of his vision. So what he sees is, in a way, both his son and seeing. Right, so he sees the seeing sort of as such that was formerly invisible to him. You know, like before, he took his vision for granted. He accepted it as given, right, and just saw things. But now, in seeing his son, or in seeing the world, he's seeing that he's seeing, and the seeing power that he was formerly blind to, even as he was using it, is now what he sees through the act of seeing. But further, in seeing that seeing power, he sees that it's a power he has, but not something that it's in his power to have, in that it's taken away from him or given back to him, you know, without his consent. Like he didn't want to go blind, but he went blind, and he didn't make it be the case that he saw again. So in suddenly seeing his son, he also sees through that seeing the power of which is a realization, like the power of seeing. But even more, in seeing that power of seeing that he has, he sees it as the revelation of a power he doesn't have, right? It wasn't in his power to have sight. So seeing his son becomes the occasion for the revelation of whatever power that is that has given him the gift of sight. And so he therefore recognizes that he is in debt to a power that he can't own, the power of seeing that he has, that he is, the power of experiencing that he is not itself a product of his experience. It's not itself something he made. So his very self as an experiencing subject is indebted to whatever the power is that lets it be the case that he is such. So he thereby has a transformed experience such that he experiences his seeing as a kind of call to give thanks to that power to which he is indebted. And indeed, the angel Raphael is there and says, "Yeah, and write it down." Right. So I just want to read one fairly long passage. This is from page 29. So he says, as archive of the narrative, or in other words, as a recorded representation of the story, right? As archive of the narrative, the written story gives thanks, as will every drawing that draws upon the narrative, right? So the book of Tobit is itself the written representation of this story, and that is the testament, I guess, to the giving power. It is the record of giving thanks and the call to give thanks, right? As archive of the narrative, the written story gives thanks, as will every drawing that draws upon the narrative, right? So every artwork every drawing that is a representation of Tobit is a kind of memory or representation of that story, right? These are all records of that thanksgiving. So, in the graphic lineage or descent from the book to the drawing, it's less a matter of telling it like it is, of describing or noting what one sees, than of observing the law beyond sight, of ordering truth alongside the debt, of ordering truth from the debt, of giving thanks at once to the gift and the lack, to what is due, which connotes at once the overabundance and the failure of the visible, the too much and the much too little, the excess and the default. So the basic point I want to get out of that is really just this idea that what's being written down when Tobit records his story is the experience he has of recognizing debt. So that's what the story is supposed to portray. Oh, but of course, that story can portray that only in the only in the same way that Fantin Latour's drawing can portray this experience, right? The portrayal of the experience of recognizing the debt is already the ruins of that experience, right? That experience of recognizing the debt can't exactly be made present, right? And so that's true of the story. That's true of the drawings, right? They are all ways of trying to portray the experience of recognizing the debt. Right? So that's why he says it's less a matter of telling it like it is than of observing the law beyond sight, where observing means both, recognize, but also recognize in the sense of perceptually note, but also recognize in the sense of be obedient to, observe a rule or something like that, right? And that's why, talking about the word observe, Derrida says, the word observe associates scopic attention with respect, with deference, with the attention of a gaze or look that also knows how to look after. So I just want to hold on to that word observe for a moment, right? The idea of seeing as observation indicates that to see has something much weightier in it than just to accurately note present features, right? To see in the sense of observe also means to recognize what is owed, to recognize the weight of the situation. So let me just finish reading that passage. So he says, in the context of drawing, what guides the graphic point, the quill, pencil, or scalpel, is the respectful observance of a commandment, the acknowledgement before knowledge, the gratitude of the receiving before seeing, the blessing before the knowing, right? And then a little bit later down on page 30, he says, whether it be in writing or in drawing, in the Book of Tobit or in the representations related to it, the thanksgiving grace of the trait suggests that at the origin of the graphane there is debt or gift rather than representational fidelity. Right? So I just wanted to end on that note, right? That in the question of what the drawing is responding to, what writing is responding to, it's not a matter of having something already presently there, which is in some sort of straightforwardly way made present somewhere else. You might remember signature event context and the theme of communication, right? Where he says we commonly imagine communication, language, whatever, to be moving one present thing from one mind to a state of presence in another mind or something like that. And that's what he's challenging, right? That notion of transfer. Well, the same point here, right? And you might remember Derrida's anxiety before the model when he has to draw on this point, right? The drawing or writing, whatever it is we're talking about, graphane, putting into marks, isn't a matter of taking one present thing and making it present just in a different way, right? It's a way of bringing to presence a certain kind of imperative that's being recognized. Indeed, it's a way of responding to a debt, observing the imperatives of one's indebtedness, or something like that. Anyway, I'd like you to think about that then, about writing, and in a way, all language, all the whole domain of the trait or of the mark of writing, as Derrida said in signature event context, or I'd like you to think of that on this model of thanksgiving, or the acknowledgement of a debt, but where that the drawing, the writing, from the start has the character of ruins, right? It can't simply make present that which it is trying to present to you. And you remember the self-portrait or the gesture of the blind man in the Van Leyden drawing, right? Actually has to call on you to do something that it on its own can't simply do in the form of making present. So I'd like you to hold on to that idea, and then we'll go on and look at the last part of the book next time.